I spend a lot of my time, most of my time, working on cyber legislation these days. There's been a lot happening, and I think for you all, you've probably heard so much about it over the last several years, you're like, yeah, why do I still care? So I'm here to tell you why you still care and why we're hoping that it's going to really come to a head in the next couple of weeks. I'm really hoping. So what I thought I would do is give you a brief overview of the issues, kind of the bigger picture, because I know you see an article here, read something here, people talk about something here, a hearing there. What's the broad picture of the issues that are at play? Secondly, what's actually happening right now? There's a ton happening right now. It's been a really busy couple of weeks, and hopefully it'll get even busier. A little bit on what's going on in the Senate in more detail, like the actual legislation that they're considering, and then what happened in the House in the spring. They're pretty much done on the House side now. So here are the buckets of issues that are up there now that you hear a lot about. The two that you hear the most about is information sharing, and Ryan talked a little bit about that and why it's so important, and I can talk for days about that as well, why it's so important. Critical infrastructure, jurisdiction, who does what? Is it DHS? Is it DOD? Who's really supposed to be doing what here? And on the other side are a list of issues that, some of which, like supply chain, are incredibly complex and incredibly important, but those are the ones that don't really receive as much attention or haven't done so in the current debates. So information sharing, current program, private sector gives the government information, but it doesn't really go the other direction, which is a frustration for industry. It's not done as well as it could be done. There's a subset of people who do it. Not as many people are involved as should be involved. So a lot of questions about how do you do this. Should it be voluntary or mandatory? How should it be done? Who should I share with whom and where? All of that has been discussed in the various bills that are up there. Critical infrastructure is the biggest issue at the moment on the Senate side. What do we do about critical infrastructure? The critical infrastructure providers are in the hands of the private sector almost full stop. So the government can't necessarily tell them what to do unless they legislate. So the question is, do they tell them what to do, and if so, how? How do you identify who fits in that category, and how do you tell them what to do? Do you tell them what to do? Is it voluntary or not? How do you ensure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing? All of those questions fall under that bucket. So what's happening really now? All the action right now is on the Senate side. They have taken a comprehensive approach over the last several years. Lieberman and Collins took a very strong leadership role, talking to a lot of the stakeholders across industry, a lot of the stakeholders in the relevant committees across the Senate, put together a piece of legislation that was pretty even-handed, and again, well vetted, as I said. In November, when the Homeland Security Committee was voting this bill out of committee, Senator McCain stood up and said, wait a minute, I wasn't involved in any of this. I don't agree with any of this. Stop. And all of those of us who were in meetings with all of his staff and all the staffers of the senators that joined him said, what? Really? You haven't been involved in any of this? So he took a political stance. The Chamber of Commerce got to him, in my personal opinion. The business interests, the lobbyists got to him and basically said, you can't regulate critical industry. You can't force industry to do what they need to do. For a whole host of potentially legitimate reasons, but McCain basically kind of backed out of the process. Up to that point, it was a bipartisan debate. It was a really good discussion. Everyone cared about cybersecurity and doing something that was important. And from that moment on, it became partisan, unfortunately. It was a very bad day, actually. At that point, surprisingly enough, there was a bill dropped on the House side, almost identical to the bill that McCain put out, literally identical, by Mary Von O'Mac, which had the same impact on the House side. All of a sudden, it was a partisan debate, which was very unfortunate. Had McCain not done that, I think we probably would have already had a bill on the Senate side, to be honest. So that's what has kind of derailed the project on the Senate side since that time, since November. There is a group of senators that are trying to work on a compromise at the moment, led by Senators Kyle, Whitehouse, Graham, and Blumenthal, trying to work out language where you address critical infrastructure somehow, but it will still meet the concerns of industry and make them okay with it. So if you think about the main crux of the debate on the Senate side, you've got the Lieberman-Collins bill, which says we will regulate industry, we will tell them what to do, we will define DHS as we, who is in the group of critical infrastructure, we will work with industry to figure out what those rules are going to be, and then we will have third-party auditors come in and monitor and make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Then you got the McCain group of the world saying, they already know what they're doing, we're not going to tell them what to do, let the private sector handle it, full stop. Then you got the compromise group somewhere in the middle saying, we think there should be some standards. We think industry should actually work with a group to come up with it. It shouldn't just be DHS. It should be DHS and others, and I'll walk through this when I talk through in more detail. But we think there should be some addressing of it, and it should be voluntary. So those are kind of the three layers. Reid has come out publicly and said he will bring legislation to the floor in July, which is a huge step. So we're looking for something to come to the floor the very last week of July. It's been moving target a little bit, but right now it looks to be the very last week. And what probably will be some version of Lieberman-Collins, maybe with some of the compromise language thrown in. We're not quite sure what it's going to look like yet. So a lot happening right now in the Senate, tons of discussions happening, a lot of drafts being thrown around. On the House side, they took more of a piecemeal approach. Each committee of jurisdiction put forward a bill in their own particular area. And then in Cyber Week in April, which they called it, which is very exciting, they passed 4 separate bills. Now, as a result of the work that McCain had done and kind of splintering the Republican and Democrats on the issue, the original Homeland Security bill that addressed critical infrastructure by Congressman Lundgren was pretty much blown out of the water. And it was very sad to see the hearing because all of Lundgren's friends and colleagues kept trying to put language back into his bill that would address critical infrastructure and do a lot of things that he really believed in. And he was very pained in saying, I really wish I could adopt that amendment, but I know I can't. So his bill actually never made it anywhere, sadly enough. But the 4 bills that went through, I'll walk through with you what they are. Information sharing, FISMA, R&D, and NIT-RD, which is an existing government program. So House is done. 4 bills went out in April. They're already done. Now all the work is on the Senate side. So I'm not going to walk through Lieberman-Collins or McCain's bill called Secure IT, because I think what's really relevant right now is the compromise legislation that's up there. There's not been a formal bill drafted. There's not been a formal text released to the public. There's been an outline that's been leaked to the public, which I have a link to. I can share with you if you'd like. And to be honest, I've been in many of the meetings discussing it, so I can't share all the details, but I've seen a lot of them. But this is the general scope of what they're looking at. So it's not just DHS deciding everything now, which is what it was in the Lieberman-Collins bill. They put together a grouping of DHS, DOD, DOC, hoping to get industry's view in there, sector-specific agencies, and private sector input. So it's more of a collaborative approach to figure out who's critical infrastructure and what do we do with them. Anyone who is named in this grouping of critical infrastructure providers can participate in something they're going to call the Cybersecurity Protection Program. If they do, they get certain benefits, one of them being liability protection, the other one being, and I think it's on the second slide, the ability to have access to security clearances, something that Laurie talked about. Is a very valuable thing in Washington, as you know. If you don't have a government contract with a relevant agency, you can't get a clearance. Under this program, even if that's the case, you can if you participate in this program, which will tremendously help for information sharing purposes that Ryan alluded to earlier. So this task force of all those entities at the top there are going to come up with standards. They're supposed to be outcome-driven and technology-neutral. Now, not really dissimilar to what the Lieberman-Collins bill said. It's similar to what they said, but it's going to be developed by this collaborative task force. Entities are going to be able to self-certify. So Joe Provider comes in and says, I want to participate in this program and get the benefits. I don't have to participate because it's voluntary, but I want to participate. I will self-certify that I follow all of these standards that you've laid out for me and that hopefully I've participated in the process to develop. Once you self-certify, you immediately avail yourself of that liability protection, which is really a strong point. Now, everyone who self-certifies will be audited by third-party auditors that DHS will bless and say you are officially a DHS certified auditor to certify the certifications. And then that certification, if you're approved, will be good for 3 years. During that 3-year window, they will do random audits to make sure that people are still doing what they certified they were doing in the first place. Who's going to audit? As I said, it's private sector entities is what they're looking at, and DHS is going to bless them. So you can imagine there's going to be a line of people at the door saying, let me get this work. It's going to be a big project. So what do they get if they sign up for the Cybersecurity Protection Program? Well, they get protection from liability, as I mentioned. From the minute you self-certify, you're protected. The window between self-certification and audit, there's a burden there's a burden of persuasion that you have to meet, showing that I actually have done what I've said. Once you've been audited and the third-party auditor says you're definitely in the program, it's official, you've certified, it's all good, then you have a much higher, the plaintiff has the burden of showing that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So there's a bit of a legalese in the legislation, to be honest, or the language that we're looking at right now, talking about when does the liability protection attach and how, what does it mean? Does it go to federal court removal? Do you use the federal rules of evidence? There's a lot of detail in it, actually, because that's all pretty relevant. Government contracts considerations, if you're in the program and you mess up, then the government will be alerted to that fact, and if you have a contract, they're allowed to consider that in whether they award you another contract or disbar you or whatever. Pretty big stick at the end of that. And as I said, the security clearance. So there are a couple limitations to this. One, this only applies if you have a cyber attack. So let's say you're a financial institution and you have an attack that falls not within these parameters, then none of this liability protection matters at all. So it has to be a cyber attack. So how they define that in the actual language that comes out, and we haven't seen that yet, it's going to be pretty darn important. And you only can participate if you've been defined as critical infrastructure in the first place. And that means kind of the traditional DHS definition of critical infrastructure, which is events that can lead to mass casualties. I forget what the actual language is I have here, I can read it to you. There's a subset of really, really bad things that if you participate in those, you get within that group of critical infrastructure. So if you're Joe Car Wash, you probably wouldn't be able to participate in this group in the first place. So it's only the folks that are critical infrastructure, and the protection is only attached if it's a cyber attack, however they define it. So there are some limitations to it. And then of course, even if you participate, you fall within the category, et cetera, if you're grossly negligent, willful or reckless, or fraudulent, or if you fraudulently participate in the certification program, that sort of thing, then none of the protections apply either. So that's the Senate side. I'm zipping through it because I want to get to your questions. On the House side, just to give you a summary of the 4 bills that passed, the first one was from Rogers and Ruppersberger. It's called CISPA. You heard a lot about this in the press. Many of you may have even written about it, I don't know. The privacy lobby jumped all over this one. And a lot of, for the reasons that Brian said earlier, anytime you mess with sharing information, people get really nervous about it. If you look at the amendments that Rogers and Ruppersberger adopted to satisfy the privacy lobby, there's really not much to them, to be honest, but they did it to make these guys happy, and they managed to get it through. Basically, what this allows is for third-party private sector entities, non-governmental agencies or entities, to become an information sharing hub. So the process here is that DNI, we just heard from Lori from DNI can bless an entity to say this entity actually meets the criteria that we would need to be a trustworthy person to manage this task, to handle this task, and then that entity can be an information sharing hub. They're not saying DHS should be the center of it all for information sharing, or DoD or anybody else. They're saying any third party can come in as long as they have the financial wherewithal and can satisfy security clearance restrictions, et cetera. They can go ahead and have this role, which is pretty novel approach, actually. The idea is to make it happen really quickly. Information sharing is extremely timely. Obviously, we need to have it done. We need to share information right at the time. Cyber moves so fast that you can't wait a week and tell people what's happening. It's not going to do much good. So the intent of this is really to get at that real-time collaboration. And again, it's meant to be two-directional. If you're a trusted entity that DNI blesses, then you get government information as well as providing information to the government, which is pretty novel as well. FISMA reform. FISMA reform is one of those areas that everybody agrees on. FISMA really needs to be updated, and the language on either the House side or the Senate side is quite similar, and these are kind of the high-level points. Instead of taking a snapshot, check the box once a year or periodically, it's more of an autonomous monitoring system. Everybody agrees on this. Whatever you see coming out of the Senate will probably look very much like this. R&D, very similarly, almost every bill that's out there that addresses R&D says about the same thing. We want to continue to invest. We like what NSF has done, et cetera, et cetera. And then NITRD, similar situation, 20th year of a program, they just are basically continuing it. So again, nothing too exciting there. So that's a really quick overview of the buckets of information. What are the categories that the Hill is looking at and where things stand at the moment. I wanted to leave time for questions. I can get into any level of detail you want on any of these bills. We bore you to death for days, but I want to get to what you're interested in.
I had a question on the, Eric Engelman from Bloomberg News. I had a question on the compromise effort. Was that presentation you just provided, to what extent is that a moving target? And there was a report that the audit requirement got dropped in one of the latest iterations. It's very much a moving target. People are in discussions every day, and it changes every day. My last information is that. In the meeting I was in, that's what we talked about. And if you look at was that a while ago, or was that recent? When was that, last week? Last week. Yeah. So the summary that got leaked out, it's slightly different than what I said because it came out right before that. So again, it definitely changes every day, and it could have changed by now already again. Okay. But that's what it was about a week ago. Okay. Yeah.
Do you know what the timeline is for that coming out?
For which coming out?
For the compromise bill? Any
That's a
language
great
coming out?
question. Great question. The compromise group met with the Chamber of Commerce yesterday? No, Wednesday. Tech America has invited them in to talk to them, and they haven't done that yet. They've yet to share any information publicly, their actual language publicly. We are pushing as hard as we can for them to do it as soon as possible. Because if we're meeting a last week in July deadline, everybody needs to see what the language is, especially industry. If they want industry to buy into this, which they're going to have, we need to actually look at what it says.
Did you hear what the Chamber's response was?
I know a lot about it, but all I can say is it was a constructive meeting.
That's what they told me.
That must be the public
Where
word,
have
I
they
guess.
met with, you said Tech America's?
They have not met with Tech America yet, but
Any other
they've been
groups?
invited in.
Have they met with any other groups?
Not that I'm aware of, no. They have definitely met with experts. They called in a number of senior level formers to speak with. So they're drafting this very thoughtfully. And I've been involved in a lot of those meetings, but as far as industry outreach, it's been relatively limited so far. We're trying to change that. Yes, ma'am.
Could you just mention the link that you said you had to additional information online?
I'd have to dig into my emails to find it, but I can get it to Maha, and maybe she can get it around to you. Yeah, it's basically an outline of the compromise principles, if you will. It's not actual language, but it will give you some direction.
Thank you.
And I have to say, they're keeping it extremely closely. I mean, the folks I work with, and I probably should disclose who my clients are, but the folks I work with, they share with me only the information we're going to be discussing. I mean, I don't even get the whole thing, and I'm going in to work with these experts, so they're holding it very close.
Is there an openness to consulting with the privacy lobby, as you call them, ahead of time, instead of waiting for EFF to write an angry blog post? Because among other things, they have a lot of technologists who have done pen testing and ethical hacking, and they could actually be quite useful in the technical parts of these bills.
Absolutely. In fact, McCain adopted amendments recently to his Secure IT Act to deal with the privacy concerns because he had been meeting with them. And I know that the folks in Lieberman Collins have had a lot of meetings with the privacy lobby in the last several weeks to try and refine the language in their bill as well. So I think they've learned from what happened on the House side. It's good to meet with them early on as opposed to wait, and they've been doing so. So I think that will be, I think by the time something gets to the floor, it will be pretty darn well vetted on that side, because they're very aware of that. Part of that goes to how they write language in different pieces. Obviously, information sharing being one of the key ones. That's the one the privacy folks really get upset about. I think all the industry folks I've talked with, and I've talked to a lot about all of this, including Marianne Collins at Mandiant, who I know very well, they basically say, we don't care where the information comes from. We really don't care the sources. It really does not matter. We just need to know what it is. And I think the government is finally understanding that. Defining as narrowly as possible what information needs to be shared is as important as anything else for the privacy lobby. The second is, what are you going to do with it? As Ryan said, people are afraid if there's any kind of broad usage you're going to be allowed to do. That's not so comfortable for people. So I know people are literally writing today language to try and narrow down what is already there in information sharing to address just that. Yeah.
I have a question, but first I want to remind everyone who's still here that in your packet there is an evaluation, a printed form that we would ask you to fill out, please, and give to either me or Maha before you leave. This really will help us as we plan future briefings. So here's my question, and I'd like you to respond to it, and maybe some of the earlier speakers might respond also. During these first two sessions, we heard a lot of really scary information about how easy it is to compromise government or industry and the implications of that. In your opinion, how far will this pending legislation, this compromise, go to keeping us safe from these kinds of threats? Is it really potentially effective?
It depends on what gets through ultimately, obviously, and it depends on if things get watered down further from where we are now. The folks I work for, and I can obviously tell you who they are, Admiral Mike McConnell, former DNI, is my primary client. I spend most of my time getting him around town and getting out the threat message. And when I sat down with Mike, I spent a year in Booz Allen building the government affairs department, and when I went to leave and hand it over, he said, I want you to keep doing this, this is so important to me. And I said, well, what are we trying to achieve here? Are we just trying to get business for Booz Allen, or are we actually trying to do something here? And he's like, we're gonna get business no matter what happens. We have a great business now because nothing's out there. So this is irrelevant. Whatever happens here to Booz Allen and their business, it will impact them definitely if it passes. It will be great if it doesn't. So honestly, it's a neutral game for them. What he said was, the reason I want us to do this is because we need to protect our country. This is absolutely a critical thing. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. He carries the burden personally, and he says this when he speaks, of the burden of having that information before 9/11 and not being able to connect the dots and arguably prevent what had happened. And he doesn't want to see the same thing happen here. This was reiterated again yesterday in the Homeland Security Committee hearings on the Senate side. Lieberman held 2 hearings this week. The first was on threat on Wednesday. If you haven't looked at that, it'd be a terrific education on what the debates are on this. Frank Salufo from the GW Homeland Security Policy Institute would be a great source for information for you on the threat. He's excellent. He testified the other day. And they all recognized, and Collins and Lieberman, Johnson, senators, they all said, every expert tells us we have to do this. Full stop. I mean, there's no one not telling them that it has to be done. We wrote a letter a couple weeks ago that was in the press a little bit, where Admiral McConnell, Secretary Chertoff, with whom I also work, Hayden, Wolfowitz, a whole host of characters signed on, basically saying, Reed, you have got to do a bill. This is ridiculous. We absolutely have to be protected here. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. We have to make this happen. So to answer your question, one of the debates at the hearing on Wednesday was, how effective is this going to be? You know, are we rushing to judgment here? McCain actually thinks that we're going too quickly, which is hard to believe given all the work we've done on this. Every single person on the panels, both days, said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but frankly, do what you got to do now, and we can tweak it later. It's so important. We've spent a ton of time on this. We've actually spent a lot of thoughtful discussion and dialogue on how to sort this out. If the information sharing provisions get through, like in Rogers-Ruppersberger, that provide that dual information sharing, government to private sector and the other way around, it will make a huge difference, huge. If other entities are incentivized through market forces or otherwise, like Rogers' bill, to go out and perform this service, great. We want the trusted environment to be bigger. Most of the information sharing provisions allow for expansion of the current DIB pilot, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Information Sharing Pilot. Fantastic. The pool of people we can enlarge in the information sharing world in that trusted community will have a huge impact, whichever legislation gets through. I personally believe that critical infrastructure needs to be addressed. I spent most of my career with British Telecom as their head lobbyist, government affairs globally, but also the General Counsel of the Americas. And we did tons of M&A. We bought lots of companies in the U.S. And as being a foreign British company, I had to go through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. So cybersecurity, we call it that sexy name now, is what we've all done for a long time, right? How do we allow law enforcement to do what they need to do? How do we allow national security agencies to do what they need to do? It's the same discussion we've had for a long time. I lobbied the Hill for years and the FCC for years saying, we don't need regulation, we know what we're doing, leave us alone. Makes sense. But when you're talking CFIUS, you're talking national security, it's a different answer. It's not just my share price that's being affected. It's not just whether I can sell another circuit or whatever. It's people's lives. It's, you know, just the couple days we were all out of electricity a few weeks ago. Look at how substantially it affected us, right? We're all running to the pool to plug in our devices, right? It's crazy. But if you think about it, the botnets that were referred to earlier, that is already deployed across, like, you wouldn't believe how many computers in the world. Our electric grid, botnets are already in almost the entire electric grid right now, waiting for instructions. I kid you not. I mean, it is a very, very real threat. So if we don't address critical infrastructure somehow, and again, I'm with McConnell and with Chertoff, we don't care how you do it, voluntary, mandatory, whatever, you gotta do something. So even if you do a purely voluntary program where standards get developed, that's better than what we have today. Let's at least start with that. So to answer your question, I think absolutely it will make a difference. And I'm really, really hoping that happens in the next few weeks. So you guys are the ones who can get that message out there above anybody. If you haven't heard anything else today, I can give you the geopolitical threat. I can give you all the threats that are so real out there. Please start talking about this. Get Reed up there to get this bill out. Do something. Whatever bill it is, I don't care which one, honestly. But get that information out that we need to have this passed.
So we have a room full of people who know something about this topic. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your views on this.
Bill Gray from C-SPAN. You had Keith Alexander last week who said we needed policy action, obviously from a military perspective, but said he doubted it was going to get done during the campaign season. So I asked you to kind of take your side, which is a little more private sector, obviously, at this point with economic espionage. But when he doubts it's going to get done, despite Chertoff and the rest pushing for it, you know, what really do you see the likelihood of something getting done pre-November?
The likelihood of it happening if nothing gets done in July is much smaller. There's what, 15 work days in September and October? I mean, it's really highly unlikely. The only way it could happen is if the folks take that time to then work with industry, agree the language, hammer it out so that when work with the privacy lobby, so when they get it on the floor, it gets through. That's a pretty big ask. So I think most of us who are working on it and want something to happen are pushing for it to happen by the end of July. We need something to happen. If you look at where there actually is agreement, you've got agreement on all the stuff that went on the House side other than information sharing at the moment. Information sharing, you pretty much have agreement on that too. It's just a matter of tweaking the privacy stuff to make sure everybody's happy with that. It's really the critical infrastructure piece that's hanging out there. So you've heard a lot of people say, especially industry, if you're going to do anything, at least do information sharing. In the hearings this week, I think Frank Salufo was the only one that came out and said information sharing is my top priority. Everyone else said you got to do it all. But I think most everybody would acknowledge that if you at least do information sharing, that would be really great. And that's where they probably have the most agreement. So I don't have a crystal ball. I'm praying that critical infrastructure gets addressed somehow. But I would not be surprised at all either if they got through information sharing because they have the legislation on the House side to match it up and get that through. I don't understand why our Congress that is being attacked so much for not being bipartisan and people saying they can't get anything done in an election year can't seize on an issue like this, which would be such a great election message, right? I'm protecting America and supporting jobs. I mean, look how many wonderful political messages you could wrap into this package. I'm shocked that it's having such trouble getting through. It's very disappointing, actually.
Do you think Senator Lieberman and the White House that have talked about the need for cybersecurity requirements for critical infrastructure will go for something along the lines of the compromise that would create incentives rather than requirements?
I do, and the reason I say that is because in the hearing 2 days ago, Lieberman's comments indicated that. He basically said, we're not that far off. And if you look at it, they're really not that far off. There's a slight difference between whether they're hard requirements in the Lieberman-Collins bill or what do they call them, baseline performance goals in the compromise language that are voluntary.
Right.
I mean, one could argue, is it really voluntary? If you're calling out, here are the critical infrastructure sectors that need to be addressed, here's the players that probably should be doing this, and then those guys don't do it, and an incident happens, I think their shareholders will be a little upset and give some ammunition to their plaintiff lawyers, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, you can argue it many different ways. So how far the line is to cross is arguable, but I actually think that's pretty darn close. I don't think Lieberman and Collins love the idea of giving up DHS's central role to it all, and watering it down to include DOD and DOC and whatever. I think they want to have DHS be the central role in all of this. But they already called for private sector collaboration. They already called for collaboration with other agencies. This is not anything really foreign to what they already put forward.
What about the White House?
So, that's a great question, and one I cannot answer. I don't know.
I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned about the botnets already being within the power grid, you know, all over the place within that. I just wanted to see how, if at all, the legislation that they're discussing would address those threats that are already existing, that are already there.
The level of detail that the legislation provides doesn't quite get into that. Information sharing will help with that. If people find them, if they identify them, there'll be more opportunity for people to be aware of that. The awareness will increase, I think. And I would encourage you, there was a couple articles that the Christian Science Monitor put out this summer, I want to say May, early June timeframe, where they talked about the botnets and the grid, and they talked about the reality of what's happening out there. Really well-written articles, very long, so a lot of good information to give you an idea of kind of the scope of the threat, kind of its background.
When did you say those were? I'm sorry.
I want to say May, early June, it was earlier this summer, Christian Science Monitor. And each sector is in a different place along the way, too. We did a program up on the Hill with the Cyber Caucus on Cyber Week on energy security. And those guys actually really know what they're doing. part of it is because traditionally they've had to collaborate. The grid is all connected with all the different providers anyway, so they already have this community of trusted people that share information. They've already kind of built the network that's necessary to do this, the infrastructure. And NERC has done a really good job of putting in standards. They've actually released some new cyber standards just recently. So the energy sector is actually pretty well far along, even though they're pretty darn vulnerable in general. They all run on a computerized network system that controls all their systems. So if anybody gets into that, it's pretty easy to cause havoc. So they're a key target, and they're really important critical infrastructure player to protect. But in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty far along in protecting themselves. Financial services, I would say, is similar. They've had to deal with the Greenwich Valley, of course, for data breach. But in general, for their business to survive, they have to protect information. It's just not going to work if they don't. They've got the market forces hitting them to do what they've meant that they need to be doing. So the financial services sector is actually pretty far along in this as well. It's some of the other ones that are a little bit further behind that these standards would really benefit. I met with a bunch of industry folks yesterday in Tech America, and we were talking through this, and basically said if you're not part of the party joining and coming up with these standards, then there's a real danger there. If there's an attack that happens, you have no liability protection today. You got nothing. So who's going to set your standards? Well, it'll be plaintiffs' lawyers. Not exactly a great thing. Secondly, all the attention that's been paid to this, who's to stop DHS tomorrow from coming out and writing regulations anyway? They can really kind of do that if they want to. So wouldn't you rather be at the party? Wouldn't you rather be at the table and participate in this? And if you're financial services and you're already doing what you're supposed to do, then what's the harm? Get in there and set those standards. That's a good thing. So I'm trying to, again, my goal with McConnell and Chertoff is to get something happening, make something happen to make our country safer, trying to build that bridge and be that neutral party to build the coalitions here. I'm trying to avail to all sides to look at all the different pros and cons to the different approaches here. We're slowly making progress.
Thank you. You touched on the DIB industrial pilot a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The industry side of who's involved in this task force, is there any overlap between the DIB, who's in the DIB pilot and who's in the task force? Do they intersect at all? Maybe is it modeled after that? Anything like that?
It depends on which piece of legislation you're looking at, how the DIB pilot is used. Most everyone gives lip service to the fact that it can be served as a model, kind of a jumping off point. I think the ISACs and the current process that's in place for that is also looked at as a model. Do you just expand that? What do you actually do? None of the legislation gets into the detail of how that would actually work. It encourages an expansion of the DIB pilot, for example, recognizes the work of existing groups and doesn't want to interfere with what's already happening. There's language like that, but there's nothing to that level of detail saying how exactly that would all fit together. I think that's the next phase, when they get to the regulatory phase or start implementing it. That's when we figure that out. Yeah, and frankly, I've talked to the ISAC folks. Obviously, Booz Allen's part of the DIB pilot. It's working pretty well. I mean, they know what they're doing. They're quite good. It's a trusted community. It's that level of trust that is really the most critical thing. You know, the DIB pilot, they trust each other. They know each other. They've been working together forever. Same with the energy sector. They trust each other, and that word comes up more than you can imagine. Trusted community. You have to build that trust into whatever is expanded to make it work, and that's what they're trying to get at here.
Do we have any more questions?
Actually, can I ask a follow-up to that?
Why, sure.
So you're talking about how there's a lot of trust and how it's getting far within these industry groups. Not that long ago, there was a report that came out in the Washington Post about an internal study that was done by Carnegie Mellon saying, yes, the DIB pilot's working, but not as well as it should be. Is that being taken into consideration, or is it getting better since then, or where does that stand?
I think if you ask anybody who participates in the DIB pilot, they say it can be better. It's not a mandatory program where you have to share whatever information you get. It's a voluntary program. And this is where you get into that debate. Do you make mandatory or voluntary information sharing? Which do you do? The reason that there's not 100% sharing of information is because the trust isn't 100% there yet. It's a relatively new program, and even though they trust each other more because they're part of that same community, they're not quite where it should be yet. That's what I hear most people saying about the DIB pilot. There are things that could be done a bit better, and part of that is really cementing that trusted relationship among parties. I don't know, Brian, do you have a view on any of that? You're in the middle of all the information sharing.
Thank you. That's absolutely one of the reasons. I think the other challenge that, from a technical perspective, is that the language, the schemas that are used to communicate threat intelligence and share it are still very immature. This is something that we as a company have been working on for some time. We have a schema we call indicator of compromise, which is basically a language for explaining attributes of a threat, a compromise, forensic artifacts, attack vectors. The challenge that a lot of the members of these groups face is that they try to share threat information, but they end up sharing things that are the most fragile and flimsy in terms of being easy to change, like an IP address, a hash of a malicious file, a file name, things that are absolutely trivial and frequently are distinct from compromise to compromise. So the first roadblock there becomes, without a proper way to articulate in a more robust way the threat intelligence and share it in a way that is anonymous but still thorough and effective, keeps that from being as effective as a countermeasure as it could be. The second part is that even if you have all the intelligence in the world, if you don't have the mechanisms to implement it and use it to protect yourselves, you're still going to run into challenges. And a lot of organizations, especially the bigger defense contractors, struggle with issues like the myriad partner networks that they interface with, where they can't control their assets. They can only control the touch points between their environments and a trusted business partners' environments. The supply chain, the fact that they might be outsourcing a part of a larger project to a smaller provider that, again, they can't completely control, and they kind of have to depend on their security to ensure that the entire safety of a project isn't blown up because the key 5 widgets that go into it have all been compromised by the smaller entities down the chain. So I think all of these factors play together and make it a difficult problem to solve, even with ideal threat and intelligence sharing. The thing is, it's far better than nothing at all, and I think that's why the vibe tends to be that, yes, it's good, but it could be better. You know, from an investigative standpoint, the reason that we often find the malicious actors when we investigate in an environment relatively quickly is because these are human beings. They have processes, they have tools, they have methodologies that tend to be consistent from compromised entity to compromised entity. And if we as a private organization can do a pretty effective job of investigating these compromises across different industry sectors, I only think how fantastic it could be if there was a way to extrapolate that threat intelligence to a much broader audience, yet still have it be utilized in a responsible and safe way. That kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about making it so that companies don't have to spend quite as much time, money, and effort on problems that are way beyond their reach, that they can focus on what they do first and foremost, their business, and not trying to fight against very well-funded and researched adversaries.
And I think I would add, in order to have the right tools for you and others to use is incredibly important. There's a real sensitivity out there to the 3 letters NSA. Everyone thinks it's Big Brother. But you just talk to anybody across the community, anybody across Homeland Security community, they're the ones that have the tools. They know what they're doing. Jane Harman testified just yesterday and said, they're the ones who have the tools. We need to utilize them to help folks in the private sector figure out what they need to be doing. One is the bidirectional, government to private sector and vice versa. Other is the right part of government serving as that information source and partner. Admiral McConnell has this terrific analogy of what he calls the 8-story building, where you've got at the top NSA and the most sensitive classified information there is. Then you've got other government agencies underneath, and you've private sector all the way on down. And everyone in the building has access to whatever information they need by going up to that 8th floor and seeing it, and then coming back down and reacting. But they only get information that they need. So it's access to everyone, but only as you need it. And it's that, I don't need the source, I just need the data. And I don't need that data, I need this data. But everyone has that access that they need and the tools, the access to the tools that they really need to get done what they need to have done. I think that's a pretty good analogy, actually. So if you get the information sharing right, and you have the right tools from government helping you, that are not necessarily Big Brother, but they're actually the entities that have the competence, then I think you really move the ball forward. So.
Thank you. Any final question before we wrap up?
Let me just say,
Going once?
don't forget the international angle. This is Congress. This is one country. This is not a domestic issue by any stretch. We're working with folks around the world to try and figure out how do we make this better. There's only one international treaty out there, the Budapest Convention, that deals with any of this in any kind of tangible way. It really comes down to the bilateral agreements with the countries and how they do law enforcement, et cetera, how they share information. That's all that is happening today. So I think once you see this hopefully concluding the end of this month in here and domestically in the US, we can then take this more internationally and actually make this work, because it doesn't happen just in the US. It's kind of silly. The internet's a global thing, so. And I'd be grateful for all your help in getting that message out.